What did the Arabs think of the Vikings? Throughout the Viking Age, Norse peoples met Arabs in several different places, sometimes trading with them, sometimes fighting with them, and sometimes learning from one another as well. The Norse went to places where the Arabs lived, and at least 2 Arabs are documented to have visited Scandinavia during this time. Western sources, more often than not, were written by the clergy, who fell victim to Viking raids, and so are not the most flattering when it comes to describing the Norse. Instead, we can take a look at Arab sources to perhaps gain another perspective or another angle on these peoples from the north. This video is part of Project Middle East, a collaboration of several YouTube channels to shine a light on the fascinating history of an often neglected region. Check out the entire playlist in the link in the description to have a look at some other fascinating videos about this region. By the start of the Viking Age, towards the end of the 8th century, the Arabs had expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 AD. He was followed as leader of the Muslim community by the Rashidun Caliphs, the 4 rightly guided caliphs, conquering Persia and Syria in 637, Armenia and Egypt in 639, and Cyprus in 654. This period came to a close with the assassination of the last Rashidun Caliph, Ali, in 661, following which the religion split along the fault lines that would become the sects of Sunni and Shia Islam, and politically led to the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate. The conquests continued unabated. Arab scimitars brought the new religion to regions as far afield as Sindh in the Indian subcontinent, the Maghreb of North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula in the south of Europe. These rapid expansions led to significant internal instability, culminating in several tribal revolts across the empire. In 747, the black banners of rebellion were raised in the old Persian province of Khorasan, culminating in the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750. The earliest Arabic source we have on the Norse is from Al-Ghazal, an Arab living in Al-Andalus who visited Scandinavia in 845. He describes the people he encountered as Majus, a term normally used in Arabic to describe the Zoroastrians, sometimes being translated as fire worshippers. Now, unlike the Christians and the Jews, who were also a people of the book, the Zoroastrians were regarded as heathens to the early Muslims, and so when they encountered the Norse that were also heathen, he does mention some Christians too, they also used this term Maju for the Norse. There may also be a couple of other reasons. One is the fact that the Norse cremated their dead. Now, this is a practice which is strictly banned in Islam, in Christianity and Judaism, so that probably helped to cement the nickname. The term Maju is generally only used by Andalusian Arabs, so those Arab writers living in Iberia. A rarer term found in the same region is Ardmaniyun, borrowed from the Latin Nordmani, which shows that the Arabic authors here were aware that these Norsemen were one and the same with those that were coming and raiding the coasts of Francia, whose monks referred to them as such. At almost the same time as Al-Ghazal was braving the Scandinavian weather, writing in the somewhat warmer new Abbasid capital of Baghdad, Ibn Khordadbeh also provides information on the Norse. His major work, Kitab al-Masalik wa al-Mamalik, the Book of Roads and Kingdoms, notes how a people called Ar-Rus took their commodities on the roads to the east. The Rus as a term has largely now been adopted by historians to describe the Norse who went down the rivers of Eastern Europe and that developed several principalities around various towns like Kiev, Novgorod, Chernihiv, and many more. They also, of course, mixed in with the different Slavic groups, so sometimes the Arabic authors get a little bit confused between who are the Scandinavians and who are the Slavs, and use El-Sakaliba also for the Rus or for the Norse groups, but obviously those two kind of melt into one at some point in the east. Now, for the Arabs, the Ar-Rus or Rusiya referred to any Scandinavians, and this was the favoured term by Arabic authors writing in the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East and North Africa. Ibn Fadlan was an emissary of the Abbasids undertaking a mission to the Volga Bulgars, a people in Eastern Europe, and he has probably become the most famous Arab author to describe the Norse. Now, at the court of the Volga Bulgars king, Ibn Fadlan mentions a slave trading people who he called the Ar-Rus, so most likely Scandinavian or partially Scandinavian people, who gave 1 in 10 of their captives away as tribute to the Bulgar monarch. Now he writes, "I have seen the Rus as they came on their merchant journeys and encamped by the Volga. I have never seen more perfect physical specimens. Tall as date palms, blonde and ruddy, they wear neither tunics nor kaftans, but the men wear a garment which covers one side of the body and leaves a hand free. Each man has an axe, a sword and a knife, and keeps each by him at all times. The swords are broad and grooved of Frankish sort. Every man is tattooed from fingernails to neck with dark green or blue-black, trees, figures, and more." As we might expect with the Norse, the idea of them as great warriors and violent people comes through with the description of their weaponry here. Now this is also true for Andalusian Arab descriptions, such as Ibn al-Khutiyya, writing in the mid-10th century. Now he records a Viking raid on Seville. It's classic Viking stuff. They sail up the river, they attack, they burn the place to the ground, they take the riches in their sea chests and they sail off again. Now he notes their maritime prowess, as well as referring to them as the fearsome enemy. Even several centuries after the last Viking raids in Iberia, Ibn Sayyid al-Andalusi noted that people living near the coasts used to flee in fear on hearing of the impending arrival of the Vikings, who invariably beat anyone they encountered on sea and took them captive. We also hear about Norse women, for example from Ibn Fadlan, who describes how they wore brooches of iron, silver, copper or gold on their breasts, as well as necklaces of dirhams, so Arabic silver coins, and green beads. The later 16th century Persian geographer Amin read Ibn Fadlan's text and claimed that these breast boxes, as they call the brooches, probably referring to tortoiseshell brooches, in Fadlan's account at least, were worn from childhood to bind the breasts of the women so that they didn't grow larger, although this is a complete fantasy from the much later author Amin writing in the 16th century. Now Ibn Fadlan gave many details of the Norse's sexual deviancy with regard to public intercourse and particular fondness for intercourse with slave girls. Now while in Islam men could have multiple wives and concubines, Ibn Fadlan probably did himself, sex was always regarded as a highly private matter. This may also explain a story related by Ibn Dihya, who wrote in the 13th century about Al-Ghazal's mission to the Norse. Now he related that the wife of the Maju's king, so the Scandinavians' king, often spent time with the Arab missionary so that he could tell her stories about the Arab world. Though on advice from a fellow diplomat, he was very careful to meet her only when the sun was up and every other day so as not to arouse suspicion. Now, the Queen actually quizzed Al-Ghazal on this, and he explained why he had chosen only to meet her once in a while to avoid suspicion. The Queen laughed and said, "We do not have such things in our religion, nor do we have jealousy. Our women are with our men only of their own choice. A woman stays with her husband as long as it pleases her to do so, and leaves him if it no longer pleases her." Now another Arab visitor to Hedeby, arriving around 970, is called Ibn Tartushi. Now he was actually Jewish and came from the Iberian Peninsula, but wrote in Arabic, and he shared a similar sentiment about Norse women, saying, "Divorce among them is in the hands of women. A woman divorces herself whenever she wishes." Well, this has been taken by some to indicate that the Vikings were some kind of strident feminists, and although it does probably contain a grain of truth where it concerns the place of women in pre-Christian Norse society at least, it's probably an exaggerated account by these Arab authors who want to juxtapose the heathen and Muslim characters in the story. Remember, of course, that while Ibn Tartushi is writing contemporaneously, the Ibn Dihya is actually writing several centuries after Al-Ghazal's mission, so it isn't a first-hand account. And in this case, they're probably trying to other the Norse and show the values and norms of their own Muslim society and character by juxtaposing it with that of the Norse. So the same is probably true for Ibn Fadlan's descriptions of frequent public displays of sex. The Norse may simply have been more open about sex than the more conservative Muslims, which was then exaggerated by Arab authors to tell a good story. Many Arab sources also focus on the uncleanliness of the Norse. This includes Al-Tartushi, who described Hedeby as poor and dirty, and that the people lived on fish and sang like dogs. Ibn Fadlan is no exception in this regard either. He dedicates a lot of time to outlining their particular vulgar, exhibitionist, and unhygienic practices. He writes, "They are the filthiest of God's creatures. They have no modesty in defecation and urination, nor do they wash after pollution from orgasm, nor do they wash their hands after eating." One thing which particularly disgusted Ibn Fadlan about these Rus was their bathing practices. He describes how a servant girl would bring a basin of water into which every man spits and blows his nose.
Then a shlami shows up and he rubs it and spits on it
Before washing their faces and heads in it. Now, to understand why Ibn Fadlan and other Arabic authors chose to focus on this element of the Norse, it helps to look first at their own culture and religion. Now, Ibn Fadlan was a member of the Abbasid court in Baghdad, a clean city with well-planned irrigation along the banks of the Tigris River. Now, every mosque in the city, and there must have been hundreds in Ibn Fadlan's period, had a courtyard, or sakhna in Arabic, where taps can be used by the worshippers to perform wudu, ritual ablution, before praying. And praying is done 5 times a day, so that's a lot of washing going on every day. Cleanliness is also highlighted in the Quran and in certain hadiths as well as being very important for Muslims to undertake. Now, it's explicit in Islam is the idea that the water must be either running or that the water is in a container which is changed so that the washer isn't bathing in dirty fluid. Now, it's possible then that Ibn Fadlan simply exaggerated the filthy practices of the kuffar, or the unbeliever, the Norse in this case, or that he didn't understand that the water was probably being changed between washes. Again, it makes for a better story coming home. Now, by the standards of the time, the Norse were actually fairly conscious of their appearance, as archaeological remains and some Western sources have led us to believe. For example, the Norse were constantly producing combs. There were also other bits of kit made from bone or antler, such as tweezers and things for cleaning the nails, which also suggests they were fond of, keeping up a good appearance. And there are indeed several Anglo-Saxon sources which claims that the Norse are so ungodly that they are incredibly vain and constantly wash and try to look good, which is why the women were always after them. So various sources make it clear that the Arabs saw the Norse as an unclean, heathen people who had sex in public, ate pork and had no control over their women. But certain sources do also betray or even openly state a certain level of cooperation, respect and admiration for the Norse as well. The Emir of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman II, had sent an emissary to the king of the Maju, likely in a quest to find allies in his war against the Frankish king, Charles the Bold. Ibn Dihya notes how Al-Ghazal frequently had noteworthy sessions and famous encounters with them, when he debated with their scholars and silenced them, and contended against their champions and outmatched them. Now, beneath the chauvinism here, with of course the Arab winning at everything, both the test of the mind and the test of arms, it does show that common ground was clearly found. The Norse love of riddling and fighting is clearly being something this Arab emissary was also eager to participate in alongside them. We also need to ask how Al-Ghazal was able to communicate with the Norse, and in fact Ibn Dihya's account notes that there were interpreters who could obviously speak Arabic, which may imply that there were older and now invisible trading or political relations between their people. And when I say invisible, I mean only in the sources, because of course in the archaeological record we have quite a few artifacts that have come either from the Abbasid Caliphate or from Muslim Iberia that ended up in Scandinavia, and vice versa, Scandinavian artifacts that are found in several Muslim contexts as well. Ibn Masqui wrote about a Rus raid on the trading town of Barda in Azerbaijan in 943 and a subsequent boat burial. He notes that the Muslims, after the Rus had left, were looking into their graves and picked out their swords that were in great demand up to this day, because they are so bright and of such an exquisite quality. From Ibn Fadlan's account of the typical Rus men's weaponry and stature, as well as the description of their martial prowess in this Andalusian Arab source, a good comparison for understanding how the Arabs might have looked at the Norse may be the idea of the noble savage, a hardy, somewhat mysterious people who had to be shown the errors of their ways in both lifestyle and religion, but who from time to time could make useful allies and a lot of the time could be useful trading partners if kept at arm's length. The Melkite patriarch of Alexandria, Said ibn al-Bitrik, also known as Eutychius, wrote a genealogy and ethnology around 937. Now, in his account of the construction of the Tower of Babel, he notes that among the sons of Japheth or Japheth are the inhabitants of the north, including the Turks, Pechenegs, Gog and Magog, the Khazar, the Alan, the Rum, the Rus, Dailam, the Bulgar, the Sakaliba, so the Slavs, and the Ifrancha, the Franks. So clearly for him, the Norse made up another of these wild and often strange tribes in the north. But they were an incredibly significant one for the Arabs, and their sources on the Norse do actually supply us historians with a bit more information about them. Now, if you are interested in this kind of topic, let me know, because I can quite happily do another video looking the other way. So how did the Norse look at the Arabs, both in Iberia and in the Middle East? As well as perhaps doing something a little bit more specifically about the Norse and Islam, whether any of the Norse ever converted to Islam, how did the Norse feel about Islam, and what was the kind of relationship between them there, or something a little bit more about the plain and simple history. I'd be happy to do that as well. Check out the other videos in Project Middle East, because it's a really interesting project and I hope people can get on board with it and enjoy some of the other topics that people have chosen to cover. In any case, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.